Economists look for macroeconomic policies that prevent economies from slipping into recessions and that lead to faster long-term growth. Yet they're not infallible. Professor David Laidler, Emeritus Professor at the University of Chicago, explains to IEA-TV what can go wrong.
So if you want to understand the macroeconomic policy problems of the early 1970s, you've really got to go back 10 years to the days of Harold Macmillan and Reginald Maudling. I mean, they ran a macroeconomic policy based on the idea that you could lead economic growth with government spending, expansionary policies, all would be well. Of course, what happened when they tried it was that they created a balance of payments crisis. Enter Harold Wilson, a couple of years of indecisiveness about what we're going to do about this. Then you had the devaluation in 1967. That didn't work very well. The Heath government got elected on a really quite a market-oriented platform, Selsdon man. That lasted about 6 months when they looked at the political consequences of doing what really had to be done, which was shrinking the steel industry, closing shipyards and things. They didn't do it. They went back to the Maudling, Macmillan kind of policies, but they did it with a flexible exchange rate. So instead of running into a balance of payments problem, the expansionary policies led to rapid inflation. And then, of course, they didn't believe in what is now called monetarism. The money supply was out of control, it ballooned, and then it shrank very fast. And you've got this awful conjunction that the effects of monetary expansion on inflation came through at just about the same time that the effects of the subsequent monetary contraction hit the unemployment rate. So by around 1974-75, you had inflation not just in double digits, but over 20% per annum, and the unemployment rate going through the roof. And you had a government that didn't believe that markets worked, didn't understand basic things like, inflation actually is a monetary phenomenon, and just a terrible economic time to live through.
Also based in Chicago was Milton Friedman, who, as one of the world's most influential economists, had some very strong views about monetary economics.
Milton Friedman's work in monetary economics dates back to the mid-50s or even before that. And his message was inflation isn't a cost-push phenomenon caused by trade unions or greedy capitalists. Inflation is the consequence of bad monetary policy, and only if you'll fix your monetary policy will you get it under control. He had other friends here. I had been his student at Chicago. We got involved in the daily policy debates, letters to the editor, television interviews. I didn't play a big role, but people like Harry Johnson and Alan Walters did. And slowly but surely, the ideas began to permeate. And then we had this awful natural experiment of the early 1970s that we've already talked about, where haywire monetary policy was so clearly related to a haywire economic performance that people caught on and the politicians caught on. In particular, Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher were listening. By 1975, I'd left Britain, but by then the ideas were well in place and everybody knew Friedman's ideas. My last sort of public conference in Britain, almost before I emigrated, was right here in the IEA with Friedman presenting his paper on inflation and unemployment, arguing that you couldn't use monetary policy to control the unemployment rate.
Friedman felt many factors in society were inextricably connected.
The link between Friedman's ideas on inflation and unemployment and modern inflation targeting policy is once or twice removed. I think the first step was to get people to accept the idea that monetary policy affects the inflation rate, and in the long run, over longish time periods, 5 or 10 years, that's all it does, that the impact of monetary policy on unemployment, sure, it's there, but it's going to last a year or two, and it's going to have consequences for inflation, and the effects on employment are going to go away. Those ideas had to catch on. The intermediate step, of course, was if only you will control money growth, you can control inflation and unemployment will take care of itself. That's what we had in the 1980s, and it didn't work very well anywhere. Then there was a kind of hiatus in theories of monetary policy. And in the early 90s, 2 or 3 countries adopted inflation targeting as a last resort based on a number of economic ideas, one of which was that, the ultimate goal of monetary policy has got to be inflation. That's Friedman's influence on the policy regimes that are still in place.
However, Paul Krugman, winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, felt that only huge fiscal expansion could ensure economic recovery.
Well, Paul Krugman is a really old-fashioned Keynesian, if I may say so, sort of pre-Milton Friedman Keynesian. And he believes that monetary policy does not have much effect on anything. If you believe that monetary policy doesn't have much effect on anything, notably the level of aggregate demand in the economy, and you've got a depressed economy, you've got to look for other tools, and the other tools are going to be government spending, tax cuts, fiscal expansion. Now, I think he's wrong about monetary policy. But we've got the experiment going in the US and the evidence isn't all in yet. We've never quite been in this situation of prolonged, as they call it, quantitative easing. It looks as if things are beginning to come right. And I'm bound to note that you've got monetary expansion and you've got fiscal tightness in the United States, and the economy is still expanding. So I think things are coming out on the side that monetary policy actually can be effective, still in the face of things like this, and that massive fiscal expansion isn't needed.
What other indicators could the central bank have examined to anticipate the crisis of 2008?
In 2006, 2007, central banks should have been looking at what was happening in the housing market, and they might have picked up the early warning signals. Indeed, they probably should have taken notice of the boom beforehand. Well, of course, they did see it. But by this time, inflation targeting of a rather doctrinaire type was embedded in economic policy, and the common belief was if the overall inflation rate is all right, you don't have to worry about other matters. There were people warning about problems ahead, but of course there always are people warning about problems ahead. So before the event, yes, we listened to people uttering these warnings. The Bank for International Settlements was very concerned about asset market imbalances. We thought about it, we shrugged our shoulders. The attitude, I think, was, and I'm afraid I'm guilty here, it was that, well, if things do come unstuck, the central banks of the world can act as lenders of last resort, and they can clean up any liquidity problems, and the consequences won't be that dire. Well, we were wrong,
What are the dangers of using quantitative easing after a crisis?
I mean, quantitative easing is a very old-fashioned response to the aftermath of a financial crisis. It's what Milton Friedman recommended the Fed should have done after 1929. And of course, there were contemporaries like Lachlan Curry who were making the same arguments in real time during the Great Contraction. So there's nothing new or unorthodox about quantitative easing. It simply says when you've had a financial crash, banks are nervous, the general public is nervous, firms are very nervous about the future. They want to hold stock of liquidity against all kinds of contingencies that they can't quite foresee. Well, quantitative easing provides it. You put central bank liabilities into the financial system. It turns out to take an awful long time for that to come through to monetary expansion and to affect aggregate demand. And yes, indeed, of course there's a problem that you can't go on doing this forever, nor should you, because if you go on doing quantitative easing forever, and it has the effects that we hope it will have, which is to increase demand, get the economy moving again. As the economy moves back to full employment, inflationary pressures will develop. And of course, monetary policy works with time lags. So you have to anticipate the time when the inflationary pressures are going to begin to come through and begin to phase out the quantitative easing before you get to that point. And that's a very difficult judgment to make.